Signalis is an indie survival horror game made by Rose Engine that I am in love with, romantically. It's just about everything I've ever wanted from this genre. The gameplay loop of classic Resident Evil combined with atmosphere, storytelling, and psychological horror on par with Silent Hill, the good ones. All of this in a cyberpunk dystopia with a retro-future aesthetic and a slick art style. It hits all the right notes for me. This is the good shit. It's top tier as far as survival horror goes. Up there with Remake 1 and Silent Hill 3. If this at all sounds up your alley, stop this video and go play this game. The less you know, the better. It's one of the best games I've played all year, and the lack of people I see talking about it is absolutely criminal. This video is honestly going to be closer to an outright recommendation or endorsement rather than any kind of review or analysis. I have some criticism that I'll get around to, but for the most part this game is an absolute gem, if not masterpiece, and is well worth your time. It's not that long either, about 6 to 8 hours, give or take, which is pretty typical for this genre. Short and sweet, so dumb excuses like you're too busy being an adult with a job or generally having a life are not valid reasons to sleep on Signalis. There's also multiple endings and difficulty levels, so don't feel like you're not getting some bang for your buck out of this $20 game. You play as Elster, who is the type of mass-produced android called a replica. Replicas are made by basically copying a human's brain and implanting it into an artificial body, so they're kind of like a synthetic clone. After waking up from cryostasis, you find the space vessel you're on has crash-landed on a frozen planet. The only other person aboard, a non-replica referred to as a gestalt named Alina Sio, is nowhere to be found. You leave the crashed ship and set out to look for her. Your search brings you to a large mining base, where you soon discover that something's very wrong with the facility. With nothing but a photo of Alina, you begin to investigate, and the game is officially in full swing. Some parts of this game may seem violent or cruel. Remember when these were in games? It didn't even seem like a warning, more like a sign the game was going to be cool. Nowadays, you usually just get this kind of shit, which just makes me think publishers are afraid blue check marks and game journos on Twitter are going to call their game racist or something.
Hey, what's the matter you, Altair?
That's racist.
You're racist.
This is definitely a game that unabashedly wears its influences on its sleeve. Most notably, Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which I've even already referenced, are probably the largest and most obvious, as well as various other cyberpunk and sci-fi works. I'm going to be mentioning these when it's appropriate, which will be a lot, and I hope you'll forgive me if you think I'm comparing Signalis to its parents a bit too much, rather than looking at it purely as its own entity. I will, however, try to keep in mind that Signalis does in fact have its own identity and style, but it's simply too obvious what it wants to be to possibly ignore. Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, and Signalis is a passionate love letter written for two of the most famous landmarks in gaming, who helped pioneer horror as a genre in games, as well as an homage to classic survival horror, which it even advertises itself as such. In other words, the horror video game genre as it was in the 90s and 2000s. A bygone era before Amnesia: The Dark Descent Let's Plays and Five Nights at Freddy's lore videos blew up on YouTube, setting a trend in style for many subsequent horror games. That being typically first person and specifically lacking combat, as opposed to the formula Resident Evil helped to establish. Signalis is a refreshingly faithful and high quality return to that formula, complete with a fresh coat of paint. This game captures the spirit of the era it draws influence from, rather than trying to perfectly mimic or imitate it, without feeling rough around the edges or dated in the way actual retro games can seem to those unaccustomed to them. It's as classic as it is modern, so if old games aren't your thing, don't feel like Signalis isn't for you. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine to see people use the term survival horror to describe any and all horror games, using it as a general term rather than just horror for some reason, like people do with movies or books. It is the absolute bane of my existence when people say things like, of course it's survival horror, it just is, or something to that effect with no real reasoning or standard being held up.
You're an idiot. You're wrong.
Acting as if it's needlessly splitting hairs to have subgenres within the horror genre. And I know that's probably what you're thinking right now, but shut up, this is important. You know that nerd in the comments who's always going like, actually, and then correcting people? You know the guy. Honestly, he's underrated. Sometimes that guy's right. I don't mind him as much, as he's better than the alternative. Horror can be a more general term, and I believe should be when horror games take such wildly different approaches from each other, like Amnesia, Five Nights at Freddy's, Dead Space, as well as Resident Evil and Silent Hill. It starts to become useful to have subgenres or more descriptive terminology, like maybe survival horror as opposed to action horror, as a way to highlight the differences in gameplay or style. It's the same reason psychological horror is a term. Regardless, Signalis effectively satisfies anyone's opinion on this by putting classic in front of survival horror. But if you ask me, it's not necessary, as what Signalis does as a game is exactly what I think survival horror describes. So what is survival horror, to me at least? I would describe it as the core gameplay loop of the classic Resident Evil games. Specifically, limited inventory management and scarcity of items like ammo and healing items, which usually provides an incentive to avoid combat. This, combined with exploration and opening up of doors or alternate pathways through the level, are what really makes classic Resident Evil tick, in my opinion. While these elements set up a sort of passive tension and decision-making process that I love about this genre. Psychological horror seems to be a far less contentious term, but the gist of it as far as how I'm using the term is I'm generally referring to the atmosphere and techniques used to trick your brain into being scared, or creep you out with things like the visuals, audio, and potentially even the story. You aren't pressed for resources the same way in Silent Hill, or at least I never was on normal in the first and second games. But I don't think it's a hot take to say Silent Hill has always been leagues ahead of Resident Evil in regards to its atmosphere, even on the PS1. While the latter was always more appealing to me in terms of gameplay, it arguably failed where the former succeeded in regards to thematic and artistic qualities, which I think helps cement Silent Hill as its own brand of horror, separate from survival horror, which I believe to be a description of gameplay more than anything else. What I love about Signalis in particular, however, is that it successfully merges these two approaches. The Resident Evil approach, survival horror, and the Silent Hill approach, psychological horror. Because again, the former is about gameplay. The latter, to me at least, is more about the atmosphere and arguably storytelling or thematic and artistic touches. They aren't mutually exclusive by any means. The gameplay of Signalis is pure classic survival horror. Exploration, limited inventory and item management, puzzles, and disincentives to combat, everything I just talked about. It's all there. So it meets my dumb criteria, and it probably meets yours too if you have any. Unless you get really specific. There's even an option to enable tank controls, which I personally enjoy, but I chose not to use for most of my playthrough. They felt a little off to me in this game. I can't quite put my finger on why, but that combined with the tendency I had to get stuck on things in the environment while using them, made me decide to opt out. They also don't really fit the perspective as well in my opinion, which is always top-down rather than actual fixed camera angles, that change perspective depending on where you are, which tank controls complement, that's why they were used. Like you would see in the earlier Resident Evil games. It's almost a shame, as they're kind of a lost art at this point. It would fit really well with the sort of atmosphere this game is going for it. Still, it's nice that tank controls are an option, and I think I see why going with the top-down perspective was ultimately for the best. For one thing, the more zoomed-out camera might help keep the environments looking a little more smooth, but more importantly, stealth is a tactic used in this game for avoiding combat, which you'll want to do to conserve ammo. Enemies have lines of sight, and the top-down perspective, like, say, Metal Gear Solid typically has, is necessary to make those easy to gauge. Things could get weird if enemies outside your vision were spotting you all the time. It's not a full-on stealth game or anything, but running rather than walking will alert nearby enemies if they hear it, and using the flashlight will make you more visible to them than you otherwise would be. Stealth won't always be possible, especially when you happen to go through a door that an enemy's patrol route happens to lead them to be right in front of at the same time as when you enter the room. Running away is still something you're going to be doing a lot, since you'll be backtracking through areas frequently, and enemies can actually get up after you've killed them if you don't finish the job by burning the body, which is another incentive against shooting your way through situations, as well as a mechanic I loved from Remake 1. It's actually one of my favorite changes that game made from the original, and a feature they never really ran with in any of the other games. Although, I guess they only had one more classic game after that, with Resident Evil 0. Unless you decide to count Remake 2, where I think this mechanic probably could have worked, but Capcom chose not to bring it back, which kinda sucks, since I think it's a great feature that fits in perfectly with these type of games. So I'm really happy to see something similar implemented in Signalis. In Remake 1, after killing a zombie they would eventually get up again later, as a faster and more dangerous enemy type, known as a Crimson Head, unless you either destroy the head or burn their bodies using the lighter and some of the limited amount of gasoline available in the game. Signalis features a very similar mechanic. They don't turn into a different enemy type, but almost all enemies can reanimate. How long zombies would stay dead in Remake before turning was on a timer that was affected by your difficulty, as well as involving some randomization. So you can predict when this will happen and prepare accordingly. Now, I haven't done any extensive testing or anything, meaning I haven't been able to confirm any specifics about how this mechanic works in Signalis. This is just my experience with it, and there's a number of variables at play, so take what I say here with a grain of salt. In Signalis, the variables of this reanimation process seem to be pretty random, at least in my experience. An enemy could get up again as quickly as exiting and re-entering the area once, or stay dead for extended periods of time and through multiple backtracks through a particular area, before popping up just as you started to forget about them. A lot of the time they also just seem to stay dead, so you never really know. It's possible that there could be some occasional scripting involved here, like completing a certain puzzle triggers enemies you've taken out in a specific area, I don't think I had any enemies reanimate more than once. I'm also not sure if your difficulty setting affects any of this, but it wouldn't surprise me, as the way it's implemented here seems pretty scalable, and it seems like it would be a good idea to scale this type of thing to difficulty. I hate to be like, yeah, I don't know how this shit works, since it comes off like I didn't do any research for this video, but at the time of writing this, the game is pretty new and I haven't been able to find any sort of wiki to consult. So not to, make excuses or anything, but it's a little difficult to confirm a lot of things, beyond replaying the game extensively at this point. So far, I've only ran through it once though, so you can still grill me on that for not being diligent enough if you want. Better yet, correct me if you've got the correct information, it's appreciated. This was just what I noticed during my playthrough, and you should take a lot of what I say here with a grain of salt. The smart tactic here, as you would probably guess, seems to be saving your limited thermite charges and flares for the tougher enemy types, like the tall ones with the shields, that can give you more trouble and take more ammo to take down, as opposed to the weaker, more common grunt types. Overall, I like this mechanic, and I like how it's implemented. It never broke my immersion or frustrated me or anything like that. I like how unpredictable it seemed. Didn't feel the need to burn every single corpse, but also didn't feel the need to burn most corpses. Then again, I didn't leave a whole lot of bodies in the first place, as I was typically avoiding combat unless it was necessary. The only thing I would want different is to have enemies pop back up slightly more frequently than what I experienced, to give this mechanic a little more spotlight and give me a bit more of an incentive to engage with it. But again, I suspect that's exactly the case on higher difficulties. I think the standard difficulty is fine for a first run, and I imagine the next difficulty up from that will be perfect for me when I get around to a second playthrough. Look, I just want to get this video done with, okay? Combat is pretty simple and will feel pretty familiar if you got any experience in the genre. Press a button to lock on, press another one to fire. By default, manually aiming is done with a right stick or mouse, so it controls a bit like a twin-stick shooter with a gamepad. There's a laser sight visible when aiming, and a square reticle that will appear over enemies to let you know who you're locked onto. It'll even get smaller the longer you're locked on, giving you more accuracy if you stop and take a second to steady your aim. I also thought this might have been increasing the damage of my shots at a couple points, like when I one-shotted an unaware enemy this one time, but I'm not sure, and I'm very likely just misinterpreting how damage is being calculated. There could be some slight RNG to damage, and there might just be a bonus when in stealth or something like that. An X will also appear through the square if the trajectory of your shot is blocked in some way, like with the shield enemies when they're guarding and occasionally with a boss or two, so it's important to keep a close eye on this. I like all this feedback the game gives you, but I found the aiming and lock-on to be a little bit awkward to use in situations where I had to manually adjust the aim. Like when you're fighting multiple enemies at once and you're trying to switch your aim between them, or if you have to quickly turn around to aim at an enemy after running away to create some distance. It's a little difficult to properly articulate what specifically feels off to me about it, but I think the aiming is a bit too sensitive, I guess, and I thought the lock-on felt kind of sticky sometimes, if that makes any sense. As a result, the game didn't always know which enemy I was trying to lock on to. I primarily used a controller though, since I like them, and I get the impression this game was heavily designed with a controller in mind. Mouse and keyboard works fine though, and potentially solves all my aiming issues, so don't worry about it if that's your preference. I recommend relying on the lock-on more so than the manual aiming, at least if you're a controller pleb like me. This is another reason I didn't like the tank controls, since manual aiming is done with the left stick while using that control scheme, which can make moving and shooting at the same time a little awkward. If you try to move forward or backward with the left stick, your aim might start drifting side to side, and making Elster strafe left or right in this scheme uses the right stick, which just feels a lot less intuitive to me than the twin stick layout the default controls have going for them. You can also try enabling quick aiming in the options, which seems to remedy my lock-on issues a little by having you both aim and lock on at the same time, just by moving the right stick. I can't explain it exactly, but it feels like the lock-on is a little improved this way, since the problem occurs for me when I'm trying to lock on and manually adjust the aim at the same time, which is usually what I'm doing when I want to switch between multiple targets. But who knows, maybe I'm just imagining it. Maybe I'm just a fucking scrub who's playing wrong. Play around with the settings and see what works for you. It's probably something you can adjust to if you figure it out. I'm not saying it ruins the combat or anything, but I never managed to quite get the hang of it here. My advice would be to try not to get in the mindset that you have to be locked on, or if the square is invisible you're going to miss, since your bullets can still hit enemies without that indicator. You can get a little too used to that with how much you rely on the feedback from it, and not just with what you're locked onto, but whether your aim is steadying and if the shot is blocked or not. It's easy to hyper-focus on the reticle, but it's the laser that's more important sometimes. There's a few different enemy types here. All of them are replicas that have fallen ill to a virus of some sort, died, and then rose again to begin attacking people. And it's specifically the replicas, the androids of this universe, and not the humans, aka gestalts, that are reanimating like this. Instead, gestalts seem to completely decompose when infected, due to being entirely organic, I suppose. So we're dealing with cyborg zombies, more or less. The details and differences between the replicas you fight are often explained in the occasionally classified documents you'll find over the course of the game. These shed light on some of the idiosyncrasies of the human neural patterns used to create them. The personalities they had before turning, along with the functions they're supposed to serve that have influenced their design. I like that there's some thought and in-universe explanations behind them and their behavior. You've got your standard enemies that are the most common and function how you might expect. They can't take as many hits as the others, are fairly slow and engage you in melee, like most enemies. I've already mentioned these larger enemies that use shields a few times. They force you to take a slightly more proactive approach in order to take them out, changing position and making use of the targeting reticle to tell whether your attack will hit them or their shields. You'll have to be careful with your shots if you don't want to waste ammo. They're usually present with a few of the standard replicas as a sort of leader of a squad. I think they complement each other fairly well, the smaller enemies helping to cover the leader's flanks. Lock-on difficulties aside, I think these sort of encounters with different enemy types mixed together are actually one of the better aspects of the combat in Signalis. These bubble-looking enemies are called Calibri, and they mess with your mind using bioresonance or something, making your visuals bug out a little and showing you a bunch of fake copies of themselves. You gotta adjust your radio to the frequencies that flash on screen to defeat the real one, if you don't want to waste your ammo by going with trial and error. They aren't that interesting to deal with alone once you know how they work, but after they've been introduced to you, they start getting thrown in rooms that have other enemies, so you have to deal with their interference at the same time as regular combat. On a side note, I like that Elster's mental state is tracked on a little graph shown in the menu next to the radio. It varies a little bit, which I assume is being affected by things like your health, and it goes all over the place when there's a Calibri mindfucking you. There's not really any gameplay application, but it ties in nicely to the sort of theme of madness and mental instability that replicas are described as potentially having. I also like the fact that Elster's graph is generally pretty stable, only occasionally straying from the center a little, especially considering what she's going through in-game. This is consistent with what you learn about her in a file about Elster units, and how they tend to be fairly resilient and mentally stable compared to other replicas. It's some nice attention to detail and arguably subtle characterization that I like seeing reflected here. There's these enemies here that like to pop out from under certain floor tiles. Usually at the worst possible moment too. There's some lore explaining that they construct the passageways they come out of and why exactly they're hanging out down there in one of the files you can find on them. Running away tends to be the go-to, like most enemies, especially since they'll always be in their hidey holes when you first enter the room and they take a second to show up. So you can easily abuse this at certain points to simply run through a room quickly without having to worry about them too much, as long as you don't hang around too long. But they can still be pretty good at destroying whatever route through an area you had planned sometimes, shaking things up and forcing you to think on your feet a little. There's a few boss fights in this game, and a couple of them are supplemented by additional regular enemies showing up during them to give you trouble, which is something I praised about the enemy encounters before, in spite of my lock-on issues. But in this case, I kind of feel like they almost didn't need to, since I think the ones that had them are interesting and challenging enough on their own, and they forced me in a situation where I have to deal with targeting multiple enemies, which you know how I feel about, and I can normally just try and avoid that sort of situation during regular exploration if I don't want to deal with it. The puzzles in Signalis are really good at hitting that sweet spot that makes them satisfying to solve, in a way that makes you feel like you might not actually be a complete moron, since you had to think about it but still got it in the end. Riding the fine line between not being so simplistic that you feel like the game is treating you like a toddler who's putting square blocks into square holes or whatever, but also not so difficult that you get stumped and start to feel stupid and then Google the answer. I've always felt like this is probably something really hard to pull off. Most people aren't geniuses, but I also think at least a lot of people can tell when their intelligence is being insulted by a puzzle that isn't much of a puzzle. The ones in Signalis are just challenging enough to make you scratch your head and think, but never so difficult, convoluted, or obscure that you don't know what the game wants from you, or it's too much work or requires some insane 90s point-and-click adventure game logic. I think part of the trick here is having a lot of the solutions require clues in the environment, so they're either partially, if not entirely, dependent on thorough exploration and investigation, rather than having to actively engage with a puzzle on a really cerebral level where you might potentially get frustrated if you don't get it right away. But here, that's okay, since a lot of the time when you don't get it, it's because there's some sort of piece missing that makes everything fall into place once you find it. The answer is always under your nose somewhere, even if you don't realize it. You just have to look for it. From there, at most, you'll have to maybe think outside the box just a little. I'm not a genius or some hardcore puzzle gamer or anything, and I only got stuck once. And to be fair, it wasn't even really what you would call a puzzle. I just didn't know what the game wanted me to do with this thing. Which is on me, since in reality it was kind of obvious. I felt like an idiot after looking up what I was supposed to do. It's a microphone. I have a radio place thing. Stupid. I also like that most of the puzzles are something that seems fully realized and tends to make sense in universe. None of this Spencer Mansion funhouse bullshit. I think Silent Hill gets away with a lot of their puzzles not feeling, like a real thing a lot more easily, since it's trying to be surreal and shit anyway, so it doesn't really break your immersion. Signalis definitely has some puzzles like that too, and it's okay for the same reason. But a lot of the puzzles here are the Umbrella Lab type puzzles that actually seem like something you would find and have to deal with in this kind of setting, instead of weird secret escape room stuff built into some old house that doesn't always make much sense and sort of breaks your immersion if you start thinking about it too much. Most of this either feels kind of like something some technician actually has to do on a regular basis for their job. Not that the puzzles feel like work or anything, more like they're immersive. Or the other variety, which is more like something you might be doing in an actual dream, which is kind of what they're going for anyway. That's definitely the direction they start to lean towards more as the game goes on, as again, that's in line with the kind of experience Signalis is going for. I think this is a much better approach than really video gamey things like an ancient sliding block puzzle or something. The only puzzles that don't seem as creative aren't really puzzles so much as obstacles that require multiple keys, or items acting as keys. You'll get a door or something that needs like 6 different keys to open that are spread across the current area. So you have this overarching obstacle that you have to explore the whole environment thoroughly to solve, which I like. What I'm not sure about though is how much this increases the amount of backtracking you end up having to do to bring all the keys there, since they each take up their own inventory slot, which brings me to my only real problem with the game. The rule of 6.
Nigga, did I just catch you having fun?
So I've got some mixed feelings about the inventory system. Your inventory is limited to 6 items in this game, which I actually found to be kind of limiting, despite being somewhat experienced with these sort of games and trying to travel pretty light. That might seem like a weird criticism, given how much I've credited that a limited inventory contributes to the gameplay loop of this type of game. But the item management in Signalis is significantly more difficult than what I'm used to, so this kind of threw me off. But I might just be a filthy casual or a boomer set in my ways, complaining that it's not a carbon copy of RE's system. For reference, 6 items is the same amount Chris can hold in Resident Evil 1 and its remake. Jill has 8, which is what all classic RE games afterward would give you without upgrades. So 6 is somewhat limiting, but not a bad number necessarily. I think the real problem here might have more to do with the abundance of items that take up their own slots, as well as how they work. The game balances this out a bit in that most items stack, such as healing items. However, this also means that using up one won't free up a slot if you have a stack, something you might be used to doing in RE in order to make space. I counted 4 different types of healing items, 7 different weapons with their own ammo, 4 usable tool items like the stun rod or flashlight, on top of the various keys and puzzle items that take up inventory slots. There's even a few that you pick up but won't be usable until an entirely different area later in the game. Even the photo of Alina you have at the start of the game when you arrive at the mining facility takes up a slot. All you can really do with a lot of these items is shove them in the item box until you know you need them. That's all on top of the handful of puzzles or doors I mentioned that can take up to 6 different items or keys to complete. My solution was to forego carrying any healing items or extra ammo most of the time. I carried the pistol, shotgun, and flashlight, which was invaluable, for most of the game, sometimes dropping one of my weapons when I needed more space, but I still found myself backtracking to the item box more often than I would like. Due to the stacking of healing items, using one or combining them doesn't necessarily free up a slot like you might be used to with herbs in RE. You can mix a medical patch with a repair spray to get a repair spray plus, but if you had more than one of each of those items stacked, then you've just used up another inventory slot. This seems a little more generous at first, and in a sense it is, in that you can carry a lot more healing items, but it makes creating space when you need it more difficult. Because of all this, most of the time when I healed, I was either at the item box or during a boss fight rather than with an item I found or took with me in preparation when I left a save room. In retrospect, I could have probably managed without 2 weapons, but if I swapped out one for a healing item, that would still leave me with only 3 slots available, since I ended up carrying the flashlight everywhere. It wasn't constantly needed, but was mandatory for certain rooms, so I wanted it always on me just in case. As it stands, I think there's just too much item variety and too many different key and puzzle items without a big enough inventory to facilitate it all. The extra backtracking to the item box required because of this usually doesn't put too much of a damper on the pacing, thankfully, but I still think it's a bit of a problem and could be cut down a little. At the very least, it's probably going to bug some people. I understand the value in a limited inventory. Putting thought into what items I need and preparing accordingly is one of my favorite aspects about these sort of games. But instead of doing that, I'm usually just packing the bare minimum every time, grabbing whatever key or puzzle item I happen to need and throwing everything else in the item box. The more I think about it, the more I feel like an inventory that's 1 or 2 slots bigger, or freeing up a slot when equipping a weapon, or one of the usable tool items are exactly the kind of tweaks the game needs. Even just making the flashlight module a permanent item on your character that doesn't take up a slot. like the radio module, rather than a usable tool would go a long way. Usable tools are items that can be equipped and used, but are separate from the normal guns you use. These items include the auto injector, which is a healing item that can revive you upon death if equipped, the stun rod, which is like a disposable taser or cattle prod and serves as a powerful one-time use melee weapon, and the thermite charges that you use to burn enemy bodies. Equipping a tool maps it to the left bumper on your controller or the C key on mouse and keyboard. I think instead of the flashlight being an item you have to keep in your inventory and equip, it could have been a permanent function mapped to something like the F key or clicking the right stick. Again, I almost always took it with me. Maybe it's a me issue, but whenever I didn't have it, I would quickly regret it when I stumble upon a room or area it's either useful in or mandatory. You can work around it in a sense. You don't have to be married to the flashlight like I am. If you know when you are or aren't going to need it, you can safely leave it or take it with you as needed. Rooms that are dark are marked as such on the map after you found them, and there aren't that many, so this isn't a huge issue or anything. You can always take it with you when exploring areas and then deposit it as needed. However, there are some later areas in the game that don't give you any kind of map, and I'm not sure how I feel about an item that is both very important for certain sections and also not being used most of the time. Just taking up a slot and giving you another item you have to shuffle around if you need the space. And if you're doing this, not being married to the flashlight and depositing it and taking it as needed, there's always a chance that you forget it in the item box, in which case you're going to be punished for not having it. I assume the intention is to have you think carefully about whether you take the flashlight with you, which is why most rooms aren't dark, but I kind of like the dark rooms. They were spooky, and had it been a permanent item like the radio, you'd be able to have a lot more of these rooms. What if you had a whole floor or area that was dark? Instead, it's an item that you're rewarded for taking with you if you encounter an area that's dark or has microfiber in it, which is like barbed wire that hurts you if you run into it, and you need the flashlight to see it. I only remember encountering these a couple times, but they were in areas that didn't have maps, so you'll have to remember them. Overall, I think I get what the devs are going for, but deciding whether to take the flashlight or not usually didn't strike me as a careful decision I had to make. I didn't want to bother micromanaging it, so I took it with me 100% of the time, and it just took up an inventory slot 90% of the time, with the 10% of the time that I actually needed it, taking up a slot that could otherwise prevent me from making another run to the item box, or let me more easily have the item space to make use of and experiment with the wide variety of items and tools the game gives you. Items like the stun rods or thermite charges that I wasn't typically taking with me in order to make space for my flashlight waifu, the latter of which is probably the bigger issue, as the game is definitely designed with backtracking in mind. The mechanic of enemies getting back up after you killed them without burning the body plays into this a lot. More backtracking means more chances for one of them to pop up when you run by, which might end up barely happening if you aren't going through the same areas repeatedly. Levels are also never too terribly big or cumbersome to navigate, and safe rooms are common enough that it's never exactly a long trip to one from wherever you are, so swinging by the item box to grab a single thermite charge for that tough enemy you want to stay dead isn't as bad as it sounds, but I still couldn't help but be a little annoyed by the constant back and forth sometimes. So I know that just now I was really critical of this game and its inventory system, and I wouldn't exactly blame you if you thought I was comparing it to Resident Evil a bit too much, but this isn't a glaring issue or anything. I kind of adore this game, and this is one of the only things that really jumped out as bothering me, or being a flaw of some sort, so I wanted to talk about it a little and explain my reasoning. It seems to me like something that would be less of a problem on repeat playthroughs, when you know what you're doing, what items you need, and or don't feel the compulsive desire to hoard every item you find, which might be exactly the type of behavior this system is actively trying to punish or discourage. I never got the revolver or the grenade launcher my first run, but still kept picking up the ammo for them anyway, just in case I eventually found them, I guess. I also just can't seem to resist when the game gives me items. Even if I don't need the items, it just feels wrong to leave them, like I'm ignoring a $20 bill on the ground. But I suppose that's on me. Could be a skill issue, maybe I'm completely off base here. Feel free to let me know what you think, and tell me I'm wrong and dumb or whatever. There's a very minimalist approach to HUD or UI elements during gameplay, which is pretty in line with this genre. Very often having zero UI elements whatsoever outside of menus like your inventory, as keeping your immersion is pretty important for this type of experience. What few UI there is, I think, is either necessary for this game, like whether your shot will hit or be blocked, or just useful enough that it can be justified, like showing you whether a door is open, locked, or entirely inaccessible when you're nearby, without you having to press a button to examine it. There's even some visual indicators specifically for when enemies spawn during boss fights. It helps that the few UI elements you have can be easily explained as diegetic, part of Elster's actual visual interface programmed into her eyes, kind of like the laser sights on your guns you see in this game and a lot of others, or Master Chief and Samus's visors having a heads-up display in-universe that you see in-game. This is probably most obvious when Elster starts to get dangerously low on health and her visual feed starts to become heavily distorted. Some in-universe UI elements from the operating system installed inside of Elster start to flash on screen. Upon completely running out of health, a blue screen of death appears as a game over screen, even prompting you to press any key to reboot. Just like other games in the genre, your status or health level is shown in the same menu as your inventory. Visually, Signalis takes a very stylized approach. It goes for what looks to me like a PS1 sort of aesthetic, but doesn't completely mimic how those games actually look. It almost looks like a visual representation of people's nostalgic memories of how late 90s games look. Rose-tinted PS1 graphics, if you will. This game makes heavy use of voxel graphics, which is something I'm not knowledgeable enough about to tell you what the actual intricacies of are and what that really means here, or what the differences are compared to another method of rendering the graphics. But I can tell you that it's something that contributes to the graphical style Signalis has, and hopefully just showing you what the game looks like speaks for itself somewhat. Like the character models, which look so alias during gameplay that they almost look like pixel art sprites when they aren't in motion. It's a really neat look in my opinion, especially next to so many of the more modern, non-retro things you wouldn't see in a PS1 game that tend to make up the environments. Like the shadows, for instance, which you'll notice multiple can be cast at different angles when Elster is near multiple different light sources. That might seem oddly specific, but it jumps out at me as something not possible for a lot of games it's drawing influence from, as well as something you might not see very often even in modern AAA games, due to the resources shadows can take up, and to be honest, I just think it looks really cool here for some reason. The aliased and low poly models against the comparatively smoother looking environments kinda make me think of PS1 era pre-rendered backgrounds, only if they were rendered in-game with the same fidelity, if that makes sense. There's a clear commitment to art direction in Signalis, and if not for that, these retro graphics might have clashed a bit with the more modern looking effects. But I think it helps a little that the graphical style on display here parallels the retro future aesthetic of the technology and world of Signalis, and nicely ties into that theme. Signalis is set in a futuristic dystopia filled with androids that use big chunky CRT televisions and PCs from their colony on the moon or whatever. Earth isn't even mentioned, so I either missed it, it's called something different in this universe, or that's just how distant a distant future this is. A distant future where people are still using Windows 95 or some shit, with floppy disks, analog film, and QR codes, I guess. Hell, they're still using paper for what seems like most of their filing, which is a lot under the totalitarian, bureaucratic regime that looms over the entire setting. There's cameras everywhere that visibly pivot and follow you wherever you go as you move around. They're literally all over the place and are a constant visible reminder of the kind of world Signalis is set in. You're always being watched, even though it's likely no one's actually left to check the security feed. Propaganda posters are everywhere, framing the entire facility you explore, and there's a lot of detail put into laying on the Orwellian nightmare angle pretty thickly in the details you get about what life was actually like at this facility before shit hit the fan. Owing to its retro game influence and retro tech aesthetics, Signalis features an optional CRT filter you can enable. While I'm a bit of a fan of CRT TVs, along with the look and sort of natural anti-aliasing effect they tend to produce, I'm typically not a fan of CRT filters. I find they tend to be a bit too exaggerated. They don't usually look like an actual CRT television, and the real thing's always better anyway.
See? It's better.
I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it due to the video being compressed, but I'm happy to say I actually kind of like this filter. It actually looks somewhat authentic, and it's subtle enough that I think it looks pretty good. It's still just a bit too fuzzy for my taste, not quite as subtle as I would personally prefer, especially over top of the semi-CRT effect that some of the UI elements already have, like the item menu. Turning off the noise filter does help bring it a bit closer to the sweet spot for me, however, but that's just me being picky. Play around with these two settings, see what you prefer. Speaking of the noise filter, it has one, and unlike the CRT filter, it's on by default. It's pretty subtle, so much so you might not notice it at first, and you can probably barely see it thanks to compression. The game does recommend disabling it for recording and streaming though, so it's going to be off for most of my footage. The CRT filter is also off for the same reason. I'm kind of indifferent to noise filters, at least in these sorts of psychological horror style games. I recognize their potential to enhance the atmosphere, but I get why people don't like muddying up the image. I like how subtle this one is though, so even if you absolutely hate noise filters, maybe leave it on for a little while and see how you feel. You might just forget it's even on. Signalis is a very surreal game. Visually, I think it sort of speaks for itself here. It's a very high concept sort of thing, and I don't think you'll find that style came at the expense of substance here, if you're into this sort of thing. As I mentioned before, Signalis wears its influences on display in many regards. Just visually, you can probably pick out a whole laundry list. Looking at the character design of our protagonist, I'm pretty sure I see the likes of Blame, Ghost in the Shell, Ergo Proxy, and Gantz. This is a good chance to say I like Elster's character design. Short-haired tomboys are absolutely patrician to your taste, and I always like these sort of skin-tight sci-fi suits on female characters. The reddish-orange highlights also help make Elster look distinct and easy to pick out during dark scenes. There's even a file that mentions someone with a suit matching Elster's description, and the distinct orange chest piece her suit has, so you know it's talking about our girl here. The highlights look a little more like just red to me, if I'm being honest, but the game calls it orange, so I'm meeting them in the middle and calling it reddish-orange. Let's talk about the horror aspect a little. The approach here is very psychological, and this is probably where the Silent Hill influence is the most apparent. You can see this particularly in some of the later game environments where things start to get red and rusty, as well as some of the overall monster design. The standard enemies have some real big Silent Hill nurse energy, which I love since they're one of my favorite enemy designs from that series. You might notice there's some sort of visual static or artifacting around the enemies when you look at them. It even persists after you kill one of them. This is intentional. It's meant to be a diegetic effect, representing Elster's mechanical eyes glitching out when looking at them. I don't think an exact in-universe reason is given for this, but it's a cool detail that's probably more effective without an explanation, and nicely plays into the psychological style of horror this game is going for, by obscuring them somewhat. It's the whole don't show the monster thing. The less you see the details, the more your mind fills in the blanks, and your imagination tends to be pretty good at scaring you. It's part of why people are afraid of the dark. Noise filters achieve a similar effect and are used for a similar reason. If you've ever wondered why they're fairly common in horror games such as Silent Hill 2 and 3, the difference is a noise filter is constant and covers the whole screen, which is why a lot of people don't like them. There's definitely something to be said about how noise filters can make even black nothingness look kind of eerie, but what I like about this visual glitching effect is that it's localized to enemies, which is, next to darkness, where I think noise effects in horror are usually most effective. On that note, you might notice characters, including the enemies, don't actually have any feet in this game. Now, I'm sure that no feet on your android waifu sounds pretty horrifying if you're a foot fetishist. Maybe feet or just foot fetishism is illegal under the regime. It's probably just how robot legs look or work in this universe. I don't know. What I do know is that I
hate those degenerates just as much as you do, comrade.
Instead, most seem to have long legs, some characters even standing at above 200 centimeters. I guess this future is all about long leg fetishes. My point here, however, is that I think this reinforces a slightly unnatural aesthetic to the humanoid characters of this game, and more specifically, the enemies. It's a detail that's very subtle and you might not think twice about, but it affects their silhouette, giving them one that is, while distinctly human, at the same time slightly off. Your brain instinctively knows something is amiss, kind of like an Asian guy wearing a cowboy outfit. It's in my opinion partially what makes zombies creepy, and it's especially present with the Silent Hill nurses I mentioned earlier. Riding the line between human and inhuman is very unnerving. Maybe this whole no feet thing is unintentional.
This shit was 100% intentional.
But I think having enemies where even the silhouette manages to be uncanny in some way is very effective. The soundtrack of Signalis was put together by Cicada Sirens and 1000 Eyes. The tracks here are mostly of the more atmospheric variety that you'll hear during typical gameplay, as well as occasionally setting the mood for cutscenes. I particularly like the sounds on the title screen. It really sets the right mood. The safe room theme is also a pretty standout track you'll be hearing pretty often. Besides music, sound effects are mostly the creepy ambience of sci-fi tech machinery stuff that you would probably expect given the setting. The signals you pick up on the radio amongst the static are as creepy as they are intriguing. You're never really sure exactly what you're picking up, but it's probably horrible somehow.
See if you can find that. Show it to Bill.
No, I don't want to. I honestly don't want to watch
Just put
that.
it on that one side.
I don't.
Oh,
don't
pull it up, Jamie.
I have to hand it to Signalis for managing to make something as seemingly innocuous, like some Morse code clicks or reciting of numbers and weird musical beeps on the radio, seem unsettling to me somehow. The screech enemies make when they're alerted and the combat music kicking in never really stopped alarming me a little bit whenever it happened. Not in a jump scare kind of way, but an oh shit kind of way. Even when the enemies aren't all that numerous or dangerous and I'm just running past them. So I think it's the sound doing most of the work here. I don't have much else to say about the audio here. It's just very well done for what it is. This is definitely a game you should play with headphones. So I thought about trying to do a full in-depth breakdown of the story or summarizing the game beat by beat, but in addition to not spoiling it for anyone and these types of game plot summary videos being a little bit of a turnoff for some people, I think I'd probably just end up butchering it anyway. Without spoiling anything, there's a pretty big shift at about the last third or so of the game, and some endings that I don't exactly know how to explain or interpret. It would just be a lot of me either being, yeah, so I don't really know what the fuck this is exactly, it's just all surreal and shit, you know? Or me being just fucking wrong and looking dumb and spreading misinformation until some Chad in the comments corrects me. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not exactly sure what the fuck happened, and it's not just my personal mental inadequacies at fault here. It's very likely you'll have a similar experience. There's some reality-bending shit going on. It's both the nature of this story and a particular style of storytelling. The events of Signalis are often very surreal, and trying to figure things out is part of the appeal here. The devs appropriately describe the story as a dream about dreaming. And let me just say, I like the story here a lot. If you're into this type of thing, like I am, you'll probably like it too. I promise it's not pretentious film school shit or anything like that, and I don't think there's style had at the expense of substance here by any means. Silent Hill does something similar. You're given the gist of what's going on, usually a premise that's easily understandable as a kind of foundation. You know, like Harry looking for his daughter, James looking for his wife, Donkey Kong looking for his bananas, and in this case, Elster looking for her crewmate. But by the end, you've got a bunch of stuff that's a bit more vague, where even if you're paying attention, you might have a lot of questions after the credits roll. Like, what exactly happened to Cheryl? What's this red cherry Kool-Aid stuff? What happened to Lisa? Holy shit, is that thing biting Harry's dick off? So you've got some stuff to chew on and think about. It can take a lot of thought and an extra playthrough or two in order to really get to the bottom of things. Not all your questions are necessarily going to have answers. Sometimes things are just a bit abstract or open-ended. Someone who actually knows what they're talking about either has already or will soon make a video going over the story, and will probably do a way better job than I ever could have. So you should probably go watch that if that's what you're looking for. For the sake of being comprehensive though, I want to talk about the story a little bit. Things like the main premise, our protagonist, some of the world building, and any other details I noticed and think are worth mentioning. There's a really cool world on display here. You're kept in the dark about a lot of it, but there's some clear attention to detail here, and what you are shown is pretty interesting. This should hopefully satisfy anyone who wants to know a little bit more about the story, but also don't want to spoil themselves on it too much. If you're already intrigued and feel like you want to go in completely blind, feel free to skip to the outro. Recapping a little from the intro, our protagonist, Elster, or Elster 512, wakes up from her cryostasis pod on the Penrose 512, some sort of small, deep space exploration ship, with the objective of finding new inhabitable planets. Elster is a replica, an android with a copy of a human's neural pattern implanted as a form of intelligence. She's a sort of engineer whose job is to perform routine maintenance tasks and stuff, and assist the Gestalt or human in charge of the vessel, a woman named Alina Seo, who is the only other crew member on the Penrose. However, after waking up, Alina is nowhere to be found. The ship has crash-landed on some sort of frozen planet, and one of the two spacesuits on board is missing. We grab an old damaged photo of Alina from the cockpit and the keycard needed to get off the ship, which we find has been left in Alina's cryopod, snapped in half. It seems like Alina didn't want Elster to follow her for some reason. Regardless, we fix the card with some tape and leave the ship in search of her. Not far from the ship is some sort of facility, which we enter through a hole. Elster opens a book called King in Yellow, and then, well, something happens. When we regain Elster, she's now in a bathroom, looking into a mirror, still determined to find Alina. I'm pretty sure this scene is a slight nod to the beginning of Silent Hill 2, which is a nice touch. We still have the photo of Alina, but if you're paying attention, it looks a little different. It's still damaged, but the color looks different. Like it's less damaged now, as if there's been a jump backwards in time. It's not even entirely clear whether or not this is the same building or planet we were just on. The game makes no explicit mention of this though, and our goal hasn't changed. So maybe I'm wrong, but the game just kind of lets you wonder about this if you happen to notice. It's one of the first clues that there's something more going on here than what you might think. You're in a large mining facility, which seems almost derelict. Some sort of virus or infection has broken out here that's been killing everyone. The Gestalts just end up dying and leaving a black imprint where I assume they spontaneously decomposed, but the replicas have a whole bunch of artificial components, so they don't completely decompose, leaving a body behind. The problem being, these bodies have been getting back up after a couple of hours and attacking people. So they start burning them in the incinerator, but they can't keep up with the pace people are dying at. Eventually, the place is overrun, and that's where you come in. There's a small handful of replicas left still alive, which make up most of the characters you meet. They usually tell you that this place is lost and you shouldn't have come here. You're not the only one looking for somebody here either. You meet Erica, who is looking for her sister, Aito. You're pretty much always descending when you progress to a new area, going deeper and deeper down into this place as you look for Alina and try to figure out what's going on. I like it when games or levels take this sort of descending approach, taking you further and further down. Especially with Signalis, where things seem to get a bit more spooky the deeper you go. There's occasionally holes in the floor that are used as a one-way trip to a lower floor, or sometimes the entrance to the next area. These also seem to become more common as you go, and things become more surreal. The game seems to like these thematically, and it seems like another influence or homage to Silent Hill 2, maybe? Specifically underneath the historical society and the jail areas. Elster as a protagonist is nearly a blank slate, almost an everyman type, at least as much as an android can be. She doesn't really say much, and of the few details there are about her, they aren't really revealed until later in the game. But what you do know is she made some sort of promise, presumably to Alina, who she clearly cares about a great deal. The photo of her is the only item she takes with her off the ship, and still has once you're in the facility. It's even described as being old, damaged, and discolored from age and exposure, so you get the impression there's a lot of sentimental value to it, and that Elster has known Alina for a long time. She's not just a coworker. So right off the bat, Elster as a character and her goal of finding her crewmate manages to be just as easy to understand and relate to as, say, Harry trying to find his daughter. This also helps to quickly establish her and the other replicas as being very human despite their artificial bodies. They aren't just mechanical husks, they can feel things. I also like how there's still a lot of mystery and intrigue behind the motivations underpinning our main goal. Despite its simplicity, it's easy to care about finding Alina, but at the same time, you don't really know anything about her. What's she like? What kind of relationship do Elster and Alina have? Why did she leave without saying anything? And why did she break the keycard you needed to get out of the ship? What was the promise Elster made? You're left with so many questions that you end up really wanting to meet Alina just so you can get answers to them. The replicas are mass-produced and often go by a model name, like with Elster. Because their brains are copies of a specific human that has been implanted into a large number of replicas, there's a lot of data on the personality types of each replica model, along with the resulting instability that can apparently occur as a consequence of their production. The repeated converting of the human psyche into computer data, along with the repeated copying of that data over time, is said to eventually result in some of the data being corrupted. Each replica has their own idiosyncrasies, detailed in some of the often classified psych profiles you'll find lying around, where tips are given to help keep them stable, such as personal items to give them or things to avoid. It makes you feel for these people a bit, because they are in fact people, just lab-made ones. They make up all the enemies, and you're being given the before and after views of them. Like when you fight a Mina as a boss, and then later meet one down in the mines that hasn't turned yet. And she's really nice. She has a real disregard for her own well-being though, like a bit too much, which seems like something that years of propaganda probably beat into her. You find this one Calibri who's scared and curled up into a ball. All her Calibri sisters have turned, and she actually wishes she had turned too, since now she's all alone. Calibri use something called bioresonance and are basically like psychics. They end up really close to their fellow Calibri sisters because of this. They're almost literally in tune on the same signal, casually reading each other's minds to communicate. But now, because her sisters aren't really dead, their brainwaves aren't completely gone. She's seemingly still picking up their signal, so to speak, along with the other enemies you encounter. So she's just constantly picking up crazy mental static from all the turned replicas that she used to know and be friends with. It's really horrifying and tragic when you think about it. There's this other guy you find who's kinda just chilling. Says he's not doing shit until Command gets in touch. I don't know, man. Kinda seems like this place is a lost cause. He's a protector class. You can tell because he's got those long basketball legs. There's a clear hierarchy among the workers here. Protectors seem to be a sort of officer or enforcer class. They get access to all sorts of benefits, like their bathrooms have stalls, unlike the regular ones. They also seem to get their own rooms, while others have to sleep in these shitty-looking barracks you find. The society that produced this facility is consistently portrayed as what looks to be some sort of authoritarian regime. The specifics of which and history behind how it came to be are never really elaborated on though, so you're just left to speculate about things. Like how this nationalistic regime is German, but names traditional of Asian cultures or languages like Ito, Sio, Yang all seem as common if not more so than German names for some reason. German seems to be the official language. Octung is written everywhere. But you also see other Asian characters that I'm not knowledgeable enough to correctly identify.
So are you Chinese or Japanese?
Did Germany start conquering Asia, or are people just immigrating there for some reason? What do the borders of countries on Earth look like right now, or other planets for that matter? I'm not arguing this is a contradiction, I think it's interesting. It's something that piques my curiosity and makes me want to know more. You eventually meet a replica named Adler and show him Alina's picture, but he's a dick and pushes you down an elevator shaft. Joke's on him though, you survive. You're passed out for a while though, during which you have a sort of vision where you walk around in first person. There's a few of these sequences in the game. You're in a school where you see a white-haired girl being bullied. You wake up to find there's a whole bunch of other bodies in the shaft that broke your fall. They're all Elster units like you. At least I think they're supposed to be, since they're dressed the same way. Beyond that, the lack of detail makes it a little hard to tell for sure, but I'm pretty sure the intention is they're all supposed to look like you. These bodies in the elevator shaft are pretty notable though. If the picture earlier was a clue, this seems to be an outright confirmation that things aren't what they seem, and without spoon-feeding you it by explicitly telling you about them. Elster doesn't even comment on them or anything if you examine them. She just mentions the elevator is out. They also really make you start to think, since they must have all ended up there the same way you did. There's also a lot of them, like a lot. If you go down a floor, you'll find there's a whole floor's worth of them stacked up. Going down another floor, you aren't able to see in the shaft anymore, but it's safe to assume there's more than you can visibly see. Whatever just happened with Adler throwing you to your death, it's happened enough times that the stack of bodies got high enough that this fall through the shaft became short enough to be survivable. Which is pretty fucking ominous if you ask me. What the hell's Adler's problem anyway? It's like the score is already Adler 3000, Elster 0, and you didn't even know because he'd been spawn killing you every time for who knows how long. Also, this is a bit of a side tangent, but I noticed most replicas are women. There's some dudes like Adler, but you look at the enemies which make up the majority that you see, and they seem to mostly be girls. It's probably an aesthetic choice, and I like that choice. I guess Nier Automata kinda does something similar now that I think about it. But Signalis, at least its world building, seems a lot more grounded, and so I'm just wondering what the in-universe reason would be, if there is any. Because they don't really have to be women, right? So why? I don't know. I'm probably thinking about it too much. So that's all I'm going to say about the story, and I'm just going to recommend that you play the game yourself if you find it interesting or want to know what happens next. You haven't spoiled yourself on anything too major just yet, and there's a lot of details I didn't talk about, and a lot that I probably outright missed. Hopefully more people start talking about this game and theory crafting a bit, and then maybe someone smarter than me will come along and make a video breaking down the story for brainlets like me. There's clearly a lot of passion behind this game as well as its story. It knows what it's trying to be, even advertising itself as classic survival horror. And I think it succeeds in that regard with flying colors. I'm not exaggerating when I say I think it's up there with the greats, and I'll be looking out for whatever Rose Engine does next. Lately, we've had this sort of boomer shooter renaissance, where old design trends from 90s shooters are being revived with games like Ultra Kill, Dusk, and even some AAA titles like Doom Eternal, just to name a few. There's a lot of indie ones specifically. I really hope this trend continues with other genres like classic survival horror, and not just horror, since general horror indie games are already pretty common. Thankfully though, this is already a little bit of a trend. Resident Evil games lately have been really trying to bring back the original formula a little bit, particularly with Remake 2, although they are remaking RE4 now, and it seems to be staying as a bit more of an action game. Silent Hill is a series that spontaneously resuscitated recently, and while I'm still salty about what Konami did to my boy, I'm looking forward to what's next with the series. Like that Silent Hill 2 remake, please be good. Which I honestly never thought I'd be saying, since it's a series that's been dead since the mid-2010s, and hasn't really had a good release since around the mid-2000s. Holy shit, Silent Hill hasn't been good in like 20 years. I hope things work out for Silent Hill. And of course there's indie games, like Signalis, but there's definitely some more out there like it if you go looking. I hear Tormented Souls is really good, which I need to get around to playing. It came out about a year ago. It looks really good too, reminds me a lot of Silent Hill. It's about the Canadian healthcare system or something, so that's already pretty horrifying.
Kill yourself.
There's more than that out there, but Signalis and Tormented Souls are just kind of what catch my eye and appeal to me personally, especially Signalis. Anyway, I don't really know what to end off with. I don't really want to say the whole smash that like button and subscribe thing, because, you know, you already know all that stuff. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching until the end. See ya.